It's often said that there's a generation gap, that the beliefs and ideas of parents are very different from those of their children. But it's not just at that level there's a generation gap. I believe there's a generation gap in language, the language that they use. That even though children on the whole are first exposed to the language of their parents and learn through imitation, from their parents, gradually they discover their own voice, their own tongue, and as they're sort of amongst their peers at school and at play, it's a different idiom. So that part of the issue of parents trying to convey their ideas and beliefs and values to a child, it's not that they necessarily are so alien, but it's just finding that common ground of language where the child knows and appreciates and understands what the parent is trying to convey, whether they agree with those ideas or not. And language is a key part of stories we tell our children. Obviously it deals with children and parents. So for the children's side, the language is very playful. There's language to me as an author is play. Creativity is play. And for me, the first draft of any novel is like being in a sandpit, although instead of having sand, you have words and you sort of scoop them up and throw them over you, and as you sort of append them to the page, or you sort of fill a notional bucket with them, compact it down, overturn it as a sandcastle, or in this case a word castle, and there's your paragraph or your page or whatever. So to me, play is sort of fundamentally attached to language. But I was trying to think of how adults play, and obviously there's sport, there's adult creativity, but in language, yes, in things like comedy, obviously there's a lot of play around there, but one of the sort of more accessible forms, perhaps unfortunately, is banter, where people are going back and across, sort of quite insultingly usually, but it's only bants that somehow that excuses it. But banter isn't something an adult could do to a child, or they certainly shouldn't do to a child, sort of put them down in words and stuff. But the difficulty that adults face is, as I say, explaining concepts to their child, because there's a sort of sense of appropriateness, age appropriateness of the concepts. So, for example, I don't think most adults would talk about death to their child unless it cropped up in context that an animal had died or a family member had died, or the child brought the subject to death. And in a way, there's lots of sort of life lesson correlates to this, such as what age do you introduce a child to coffee? I myself have never drunk coffee. I was never exposed to it personally. Obviously my parents drank it, but they didn't foist it on me. So what age do you introduce a child to coffee where it's not going to be sort of bad for their health? Presumably most children discover it as they sort of have essay crises and late night homework, and they have coffee either to keep them going through the nights as they meet their deadline, or to refresh them the next day when they haven't had much sleep. But it is more involved than that, obviously. Parents have to sort of monitor their words, as I say, make them age appropriate, the concepts that they're explaining, make them age appropriate in terms of the words that they're using. They might have to simplify their language in explaining things. So, where do these two levels of language and play versus sort of serious explanation, how do they sort of meet? And in the book, as I say, there's a lot of playfulness in the language, and every section has a pun for its title heading. But they're quite sophisticated puns. They're not cheesy puns. They sort of inbuilt the concept behind the story, and that is what is punned on. To give that suggestion of the serious, thoughtful nature of what parents, how they present things verbally to their child. So hopefully this book is that sort of intermeshing of the playfulness, but also the level at which things are explained to our children.